Welcome. If you're joining us, you're in the NEBC webinar. We're going to do a deep dive here into 6PPD-Q. My name is Greg Mint, Executive Director of NEBC. And just little housekeeping items while people are still entering the room. We will be taking questions throughout the webinar, probably holding them until the end. But if you do have a question, put that in the Q&A feature. There's a Q&A icon and graphic at the bottom. Go ahead and enter those questions there, and we'll try to get to those as we have time. We'll also be recording this webinar, and it will be on the NEBC YouTube channel. We'll have that posted tomorrow, and we will send you a link to the webinar as well as a copy, a PDF of the presentation today. We've got a full room. If you could see the room virtually, we have a great turnout for today's webinar. So with that, I'm going to just turn it over to Andrew Patterson to kick this off. He is the Vice President of Innovation and Development with Eurofins Environment Northern California. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Andrew, and take it from here.
Thank you so much, Greg. Let me just get things started here. Hi, my name is Andrew Patterson. I'm the VP of Innovation and Development for Eurofins, Northern California. What that means is that I either refine existing methods, come up with new methods, have a background in PCBs, dioxins, and other high-res analyses, as well as the wide world of PFAS. And more recently, emerging contaminants like 6PPD, 6PPD-Quinone, as well as microplastics. We have a fantastic microplastic lab that has some tie-ins with 6PPD and tire wear particles. Just generally happy to be here presenting to the NEBC. And what I hear is a crowded room. Once upon a time, I used to do college radio, and they told us there was many, many people listening. But sometimes I think there was a lot less people listening. But I still like talking out into the ether, and this is one of my favorite topics. So we're going to dive into 6PPD, 6PPD-Q trends. There's some more matrices, more compounds, and more, as I like to say. So we're going to cover some tissues because it's the task at hand. It's on the tip of everyone's tongues. I really think there's some utility in wipe samples. And we're hearing, of course, on some of those new matrices about the potential for airborne 6PPD. And what conversation wouldn't be complete without some chlorination and chlorination byproducts that's happening. So we're just going to kind of cover the state of the science, what's happening right now, and what we see kind of coming down the road. This is really meant to be educational. If there's something that somebody has to ask a question right on, that's happening right away, Greg said he would stop and for some important questions. Otherwise, I'll be around at the end of the hour, the top of the hour, to talk about any Q&A issues that folks might have. So I was down at the National PFAS Conference in Tucson, sunny Tucson, just a couple weeks ago, and I had the pleasure of meeting Hunter Gibbs, who was graduating from the University of Arizona, and he's off to, I believe, Georgetown Law. But he had a poster that was on 6PPD, PFAS, and microplastics, and it's like the trifecta of some of my interests and what I like to work on. And so this idea, this multi-residue idea, isn't new, but it is, I think, a good glimpse at reality. And the person that made this poster was in their early 20s, and they're no doubt going to go off and do great things. I think Hunter wanted to be a lawyer and fight the good fight, so to speak. But I just thought it was interesting that, walking into the National PFAS conference, I see something that's covering the overlap between 6PPD, PFAS, and microplastics, because that's reality. That's what's happening in the environment. And that's what labs like Eurofins are trying to tackle. Albeit most times folks are looking at either microplastics or PFAS or 6-PPD-Quinone. That's not how they exist in the environment. And so I think this is just a neat nod to the kind of comprehensive outlook that the younger folks that have, and that realize like this is like a holistic issue. So this was a great poster. The National PFAS conference was great. And it's great to see other emerging contaminants creeping into it, much like PFAS did a long time ago with, say, things like the dioxin conference. I was traveling down to Santa Cruz on a family trip recently, and we see these in California's Central Valley, and I'm sure they're dotted all around the country. But I rolled down the window really fast to take a picture because, I thought this was not an abnormal thing to see in California, where we have a manure pile that's from cattle, dairy cows in this case, that's covered in white plastic and then held down with a bunch of tires that, as you can see, are sunken into that white plastic. I think this would have the potential to be like a giant Keurig coffee machine for 6-PPD quinone with the rainfall hitting those tires in that plastic and then running off to who knows what river or stream. So I'm not saying we should regulate something like this, but once you once we've opened up the can of worms that is 6-PPD and 6-PPD quinone, you can look around the environment, you can look around where you are and see like examples of, oh, maybe that's a point source. What's happening there? So we're also been working with various tribal governments and other progressive folks to look at things like docks, to look at things like where there are kind of these easy, low-hanging fruit, so to speak, instances where we can remove the point sources. Don't get me wrong, like I really think that using tires recycling these tires to have a new life and a new purpose is a great idea. But when something like this emerging contaminant rolls around, we really have to evaluate, the utility that you're getting out of that versus the potential for leaching 6-PPD, 6-PPD quinone into waterways. So just some examples from where I am. There's been a lot of progress. So if we look all the way back to December 2020, um, this was the paper that started it all. This was the paper from University of Washington and Washington State University and a lot of the others don't get enough credit. And it hit like a Mack truck. Because what spawned out of that was a lot of frenzy, our lab included, where we started the publication did a great job in describing the single chemical that was responsible for the coho death, but it didn't have time or scope to go into how to extract that compound from stormwater, the primary matrices that we're looking at here. So our lab, Eurofins Northern California, went into a state where we were just trying everything we could with the standards that were available at the time. Long story short, that SOP morphed into what would become draft method EPA 1634. We worked with Region 10 and the Office of Water, and it was, a huge honor to work with these folks to have our method become the method. But that was a little bit ago, and so a lot has happened since then. I try to preface this with the fact that these compounds are added to tires to achieve safety standards. So PPD compounds, 6-PPD is added to tires to achieve these safety standards so that tires don't become brittle and explode on the roadways or just wear out prematurely. But 6-PPD quinone is not added to tires. It's the parent compound 6-PPD that is added, and in the presence of scavenging ozone to protect that tire from ozone, what it was 6-PPD was designed to do, it forms that quinone form, which is the toxic form to coho and other aquatic species. And it's that form that then washes off into the roadways, and tires can continue to bloom for years. The bloom is when a compound like 6-PPD is coming to the surface and reacting. And I'm reading in different articles that takes about 8 or 9 years to fully bloom all the 6-PPD out of a tire, which then forms quinone. So it's not like it's going away. It's just that is coming to the surface, 6-PPD being transformed into the quinone form and mechanically being sloughed off. It's not just salmon, and I can say that, from the lab's perspective, we really did see a lot more action when the need for delineation, it wasn't just in salmon habitat, but it was in fact, rainbow trout habitat. These are two great papers. This one's fairly recently, March 2026, talking about how rainbow trout are also susceptible to 6-PPD, 6-PPD quinone. Not as acutely toxic as coho salmon, but it's still there. And the question is, who has rainbow trout? Pretty much all 50 states have rainbow trout. And we've seen this issue morph quickly from a Pacific Northwest issue into a national issue and even a global issue. We've done samples as far west as Fiji. We've done samples from the southern hemisphere. deep into the EU as well. So this is a global issue. Everyone's taking a look at this, and it really was this toxicity to rainbow trout that made things like water treaties even more pertinent to the discussion around 6-PPD. More matrices for 6-PPD-Q. I think we all saw this coming. It's not just going to be stormwater, but that was the primary matrix that EPA 1634 addressed, actually not just stormwater, but like also surface water and other aqueous matrices. But we've gone beyond that now at this point, and we're doing things like wipes. We're thinking about things like tissue and also 6-PPD in air. We had this really neat opportunity where we were able to acquire some juvenile coho that were dosed specifically with a whole lot of 6-PPD quinone. In this case, it was 3 ppd, 6-PPD quinone. That was the dosing. We can tell you that 3 ppb is certainly a lot higher than the LC50 of around 100 ppt, just under 100 ppt. So, the kicker was that all these juvenile coho did perish. But instead of just having that be the end of the experiment, I was talking to this group and I asked if they could send these down to Sacramento. And in fact, they did. And what better matrix to develop a tissue protocol than dosed coho salmon? So we gave these juvenile coho kind of a second life, so to speak, in which we were determining how best to extract out the 6-PPD quinone from this tissue. I'm a chromatographer, so I really like looking at chromatography, and especially pretty good looking chromatography, which I think this is a representation of, where we have our LCS or a positive control showing those top two shaded ions. Those are the two ions of 6-PPD quinone. And we have our extracted internal standard to use 1633 language, where we are adding that 13C6 isotope of 6-PPD quinone to our samples before any manipulations, before any extraction steps or anything else like that, so that we can then perform isotope dilution quantitation. So you can see that when we had a half a gram of coho and just over a gram of coho, that we had some substantial hits, and that we also were looking chromatographically similar to our LCS, which is what we want to do. There's no matrix in the LCS, and there obviously is with the live sample. So that all looked really good. And what did we find in these coho? We found about, in the most significant case, we found 40 to 50 nanograms per gram of tissue. And in fact, we did some additional serial sonication to see how exhaustive our procedure was and adjusted accordingly. But I think you can see there, IDA stands, that is isotope dilution analyte. That stands for our recovery or isotope. So we're recovering that isotope that we spiked in there before this process really, really well, which always makes us happy. But we did have some questions. Should this be lipid corrected? Probably not. What we're going with, that's usually a log KOW of around 5.5, that something would want to be lipid corrected. Should we be doing the edible portions versus the whole specimen? That depends on the goal. If you're looking to just see what's out in the environment, you'd want to do a whole specimen, much like you would a PFAS sample or PCB. But if you're looking at what humans are exposed to, you'd want to do edible portions like the fillet, skin on, skin off type of thing. And then what mass should be extracted to be biologically relevant? There is no standard right now for an official tissue method. But if we really want to get down to where there would be something biological relevance. And so if we ran the same exposure scenario where 3 ppb resulted in about a 50 ppb tissue concentration, if that's linear, to get down to a 90 ppt exposure, that would be being able to detect 1 part per billion tissue concentration. So I think we're safely in that range, and I think this is what people should be discussing when we're talking about emerging contaminants. Is where do we want to be before we drive the results down to as low as we can get? Let's start stepwise, incrementally. Where is biologically relevant to be when we're talking about tissue samples? So I think that is still up for discussion, but we know now that when coho are dosed with this, that we can effectively extract the 6-PPD quinone out of these carcasses or out of the homogenized carcasses and get some pretty good results and some pretty good recovery. So this is kind of the next frontier is tissue monitoring. And it could be anything. In this case, it was coho, but I don't doubt that we're going to be seeing bivalves and other tissues like that come across my desk. So, switching gears from tissues now to wipe samples. I'm a big fan of wipe samples. We do these a lot for emergency response. If there's a fire in an area, we are going to be wiping for dioxins and furans. We've wiped different cleanup applications for PCBs. When there are static installations for things like a triple F, after those are cleaned, we can take a wipe sample and extrapolate that area of the entire mechanical thing that we're trying to look at just from a small wipe sample. Typically, that's either a 5 by 5 centimeter, or a 10 by 10 centimeter area that's wiped with a solvent dampened gauze. And then folks ship that to the lab, and we follow our solid protocol, which we've had long established, to get quantitative results on 6-PPD, and then we are doing a presence absence on the quantitative on 6-PPD quinone and presence absence on the 6-PPD parent compound. The parent compound is, some folks are trying to quantitate for that. We find it to be so reactive that wouldn't have defensible data for the parent compound if our own standards are reacting. But we are providing a presence absence where you can indicate that there might be a reservoir or a point source for additional 6-PPD quinone formation, even in the absence of anything else happening. So, big fan of wipe samples. How are the wipe samples handled? Just like a solid sample, where we're adding that 13C6 isotope to the wipe once it gets back into the lab. We perform a serial sonication followed by an SPE. And then we add our non-extracted internal standard, just like the EPA 1634, which is the D5 6-PPD quinone. And if everything works out, we get something that looks like our extracted internal standard, plus the native compound if it is present. I did recently run a wipe sample study on street basketball, and this started out just being kind of more for fun, more for an exercise in what kind of mass transfer did we get. But it ended up turning out really interestingly because first of all, the basketball was clean. It would be a different topic if the rubber basketball had the 6-PPD quinone preservative, but we can tell you that that started out nice and clean. I had my test subjects, aka my kids, the neighborhood kids, play street basketball for half an hour. And then we wiped their hands and we wiped the ball and we wiped the street to see what kind of mass transfer of 6-PPD quinone that we got. I should point out that although these kids in this ball are very mobile, wipe samples are great for something that you can't move. Think like big rolls of media or static installations or something that's just not movable. Wipe samples are a great option for that if you can't ship the thing that you're trying to test. So what did we get from the basketball? The gloves, thankfully, were also clean. And we did get, and this is one of those projects where this just happened to turn out concentration-wise, like in a really sweet spot of our analysis where we could get definitive results on everybody, but it didn't quite blow us out of the water, so to speak, with super high concentrations. What I liked about this, and I won't give away which one of these kids was my kids, but player B is known to be a ball hog, and you can really see that player B had the highest concentration there. So it was, a little bit of vindication for my kids where they're like, so and so is a ball hog. And I'm like, you can see it in the data here. They look like a ball hog. So I understand that this was first presented to the state of Washington, and I understand that they've passed this on to the Department of Public Health, and maybe having these data become a public service announcement, which would be really interesting. And these will also all be published likely in early 2027 with some additional elements added onto it. So what started as kind of like a fun experiment is going to turn into a peer-reviewed publication, which is always pretty interesting. So I'm switching from tissues to wipes. Now we're going to talk about solids and tire-derived products, which even has an acronym of TDP. So we're doing a lot of testing of consumer products, construction products, and everything. And there are obviously different, there's the catalog for recycled tire goods, which again is a great idea to take these tires that would be waste and end up in landfills and do something else with them. But we really do have to look about how we approach these samples. If you get a tire-derived product, do you grind it up? Do you homogenize it? Because that homogenization will expose that sample to more oxygen and trace amounts of ozone. So that chicken or the egg comment really is to like, well, do we test this as is? If it's big enough, do we do a wipe test? How exhaustive do we want this to be? Do we do some sort of aqueous leaching project, or can we just test it as is? Um, this is a big debate right now, and the debate actually goes a little step further, where folks are talking about legislators and different people are talking about, well, what if we use these tires as fuel for things like cement kilns, which is already happening some places. There's a lot of energy packed into tires, and there are a lot of tires. So maybe liberating that energy in the form of an incineration as fuel might work as long as it was approached the correct way. There's in fact a long discussion about this, and it really goes into talking about like, are tires solids or are they wastes? Like, what's the permits around this? And the reason I put up that link there at the bottom is that these discussions go on and on and on. And honestly, I get a little snoozy when people start talking about a lot of legislation, unless it's like scientific legislation. And this seems more like folks talking about the difference in what to call the tires before you incinerate them. But it does matter at the end of the day what we're going to do with all these tires. So we're going to let these folks hash this out, what to call this. But in the meantime, there's been some great science wrapped around gas phase release of 6-PPD from tire materials. So this doesn't even get this publication here that I list doesn't even get to the incineration fact. But it does talk about that just under normal driving conditions. This is under just somebody driving their car around. That flash temperature where the rubber literally meets the road can hit 190 C and then cools off rapidly. But when it does, this paper was observing releases of gas phase 6-PPD, pretty substantial. And this was also one of the same publications that talked about used tires that were about 8 years old, showing depletion of 6-PPD. And a colleague of mine just pointed out the other day that that tire manufacturers, auto manufacturers recommend that you change your tires at least once every 8 years. Whether that is coincidental or not, I don't know. But there's really two things that I took from this publication is that one, when you're driving around, we're not talking about, tire wear particles or driving in the rain where the rain is going to mechanically wash off 6-PPD quinone or anything else like that. Just the act of driving releases vapor phase 6-PPD. And if you do let tires sit around long enough, the 6-PPD will come to the surface and bloom and either transform into 6-PPD quinone among other transformation products, or just go off into the atmosphere. So this is kind of a curveball. And I think this work is really excellent, and it really does get into the everything counts in large amounts, because the reason you have cars is so that you can drive them around. So just driving, no particles, nothing else. You're releasing vapor, 6-PPD quinone into the atmosphere, or 6-PPD into the atmosphere just by driving. So I think in pictures, and I like pictures a lot better than a bunch of words. And so I made this graphic where, what are the contributions to the environment for 6-PPD quinone? We've got tire wear particles. Those are technically microplastics and somewhat difficult to analyze microplastics at that. We've got wet deposition, we've got stormwater runoff. This is, painting this picture, but now there's something new to think about, which is 6-PPD vapor. And so just by driving around, and that sometimes these schematics get a little funky with structures and everything. But just by driving around, one is going to release 6-PPD vapor, and that will then interact with ozone, either at ground level or up in the troposphere to produce the quinone form, which is then a lot stickier, so to speak, and wants to be particulate bound, which is then going to get rained down in the form of rain. So it's coming at us from all angles recently, and kind of skipping forward to kind of what that means for vapor phase wise. 6-PPD is more volatile than 6-PPD quinone. So that 6-PPD is going to be in the vapor phase until it's converted into the quinone phase, and then it's going to stick to a particulate and then come down perhaps the rain or be transported elsewhere. So an interesting thing that, along roadways, should we be monitoring for 6-PPD and 6-PPD quinone? If we're monitoring for 6-PPD, 6-PPD quinone in air, should we be filtering and looking at a filter head to trap the particulates? If we do that, what's the distribution between where the quinone is and where the 6-PPD is? That 6-PPD is going to be that reservoir, that point source for 6-PPD quinone. And so really, although we have a tough time getting a specific concentration on the 6-PPD, we really should be monitoring for it all the time. And we do by request here at Eurofins, we can monitor for that parent 6-PPD presence absence in almost all the matrices we look at because it is important. We don't see 6-PPD in aqueous samples because the half-life is around 2 to 3 hours, and so that conversion has already happened where we just see the quinone form with aqueous samples almost all the time. But in solids, it's a different picture. And in air work, I'm guessing it's a different picture where that transformation hasn't happened. And in fact, 6-PPD can convert in vivo to 6-PPD quinone, even in the absence of pure ozone. So where I'm going with this, if anyone out there in webinar land wants to start a rainwater study, I want to start a rainwater study. Also, atmospheric monitoring, I would love to hear curious parties. This is something I think that we're all going to have to tackle together. There's been some really great work already, but we would like to throw our hat in the ring with support for some of these various projects. If we did start a rainwater study, we do have the ability to look at a lot of rain these days, 20, 50, or even 100 liters or more to look at rain. So let me know. What comes next? There's always something on the horizon. And I've been asked various times about drinking water and 6-PPD quinone. And to date, the scientific community, has not detected 6-PPD quinone in drinking water that anyone's waving around, except for there was this one instance, and this was up in, I believe, upstate New York, where they were detecting 6-PPD quinone in the drinking water. But once the scientists went back and deconstructed the entire scenario, they found out that it was actually from some rubber. So surprise, surprise, some rubber plumbing compounds and rubber plumbing polymers that were used in that piping system that were the origin of 6-PPD quinone. Now, when that water was delivered, one would be consuming 6-PPD quinone because that your body doesn't know the origin or discriminate against the origin of a chemical. It's just present. But it was not in the source water. And so I think that's one of these take homes where we're not finding 6-PPD quinone in finished water. The detections were again from rubber plumbing gaskets, but something similar between the rubber plumbing gaskets, which is DPG. When you chlorinate that, you get chloro DPG, which is a chlorination byproduct, and it's known as a chlorination byproduct. So when you chlorinate 6-PPD quinone, what's going to happen with that one? In fact, do you get chloro or dichloro 6-PPD quinone? What does that look like? Or are you getting chlorines maybe on both of these rings? I'm showing structures here just for similarity. There's not going to be a quiz, but it appears from some recent research that 6-PPD quinone is not destroyed in the chlorination process, but instead forms some chlorination byproducts. Should sound familiar. So now, although we're not seeing 6-PPD quinone in drinking water, the reason we might not be seeing that in drinking water is that it could be chloro or dichloro or some other transformation byproduct that would be masking 6-PPD quinone, because in fact it's not 6-PPD quinone anymore. And the whole reason our LCMS MS instruments our work is because of their specificity and selectivity, where we can discriminate one compound from the next. That's really what gives it validity. So it's while 6-PPD quinone may not have been in that drinking water, there could have been chlorinated disinfection byproducts of 6-PPD quinone that we're just not finding out, or that we're just now finding out about. Not too much of a surprise, the standard EPA disinfection byproduct, DBP, does not include any 6-PPD quinone chlorinated transformation products because we're just finding out about them. But there's a couple kickers with this. We could monitor for these. We could monitor for these at Eurofins, but we don't have a lot of standards yet. Um, this paper, this Chow 2025 paper, I know there's a ton of structures on here, and that's intentional. It's really, there were 24 transformation products from 6-PPD quinone that included chlorine. And I'm going to skip backwards. I don't want to give anyone whiplash here. This is the paper that I'm pulling these data from, which I found really compelling, because there was all sorts of end products that we could be looking for. And luckily, I know some folks in the standard community, standard formulation community are on this call right now. And these are the conversations that we want to have based on these compounds here. Which one of these would we want an authentic standard for? Because this work was all done in non-target analysis, or NTA, where it was a QTOF that was used, and they determined all these structures based on exact mass, but they didn't have any standards to be able to quantitate these, because that's the whole point of the paper, was to investigate new products. But in a quantitation setting and in a regulatory setting, we need standards. So we are going to be looking for some of those standards. And probably, if we're talking about things like toxicity, we'd be wanting to look for the more predicted toxic compounds. QSTR is quantitative structure toxicity relationship, predicted toxicity. And so when these models are popping out, the more toxic transformation products, should we be looking at those? This TP180 was giving a QSTR rating of 101 times the toxicity of 6-PPD quinone, based on that paper. So we would love to look for something like that in drinking water, and beyond. That compound TP180 is quite a different structure than 6-PPD quinone, but it could be added to EPA 1634 if we really wanted it. But we need chloro 6-PPD-Qs to be able to look around and quantitate that. I think there are some other publications coming out specifically looking at the chlorinated transformation byproducts of 6-PPD quinone. But it's one of those, when I've heard anecdotally, oh, there's no 6-PPD quinone in drinking water. That's true. But could there be some other chloro 6-PPD-Qs that are floating around in there? And by the way, kind of the elephant in the room here, is that effluent is also chlorinated and not just drinking water. And I've heard anecdotally that some wastewater treatment plants have been tested for 6-PPD quinone, and we're getting 0% detection frequency in the tertiary effluent, but 100% detection frequency in the biosolids. And so um, that's interesting on its own. But is that effluent, although it doesn't have 6-PPD quinone, could it have chloro, dichloro, some other chlorinated product of 6-PPD quinone? And that's the reason that we're just not seeing it. We're not picking it up on our instruments. This is really, I think one of the more interesting new topics of 6-PPD quinone are these chlorinated transformation products. Same with the atmospheric issue. A lot of focus, the main kind of glut of the focus has been on stormwater runoff. But are we kind of missing another elephant in the room, which is that vapor phase 6-PPD, which could then be having 6-PPD quinone completely distant from roadways and freeways and parking lots and things like that where there are some vehicles. So, if this becomes like uncoupled from vehicles and we're seeing this atmospheric transport, what does that mean for testing and everything else like that? Other tire constituents are coming. This is a graphic that I really like, that I pulled from NOAA back in 2021 because I thought it did a really great job of describing the journey from University of Washington and Washington State when they were looking for 6-PPD quinone. In fact, the work was done to create a tire slurry and then fractionate that tire slurry such that the toxic fraction or the fraction where they were seeing cohort mortality could be narrowed down to less and less compounds in that investigation until they just came up with one. And so we do get asked about other PPDs and other tire constituents. And I think back to this, and they're coming. They're gonna get here. But I think back to this graphic where if any of these other compounds were as acutely toxic to coho salmon, at least, they would have found it. It would have shown up here where there's not just one compound that's resulting in the coho mortality. There'd be more than one, or at least an ambiguous result. So compounds, there are other PPDs in tires. I would imagine that a method update would look something like this, where we have other PPDs, and then we have some vulcanizing agents. I know that my Australian colleagues have added on HMMM. That's not but it's also fun to say. They've added on HMMM to their 6-PPD quinone method with success, and so I think that could happen here. We're eager to see if there is a method update, and we do have some clients asking about other PPD compounds that we're in this state of kind of this crossroads of what compounds to add, what's pertinent. There's also the issue that compound discovery is not so popular for all parties, and so us as an analytical laboratory, we're very neutral on the issue. We want to support what's being asked, and we always try to stay relevant. And so as this analysis matures, I do think we're going to see some other compounds. Again, that's based on the standards availability. There's not standards for every single one of these. But there is, like if we're talking about what to add in, I think IPPD is a really interesting one because you'll see it's asterisk there. And if this would move, you could see that another chlorination byproduct, NDMA. There's been a study on the paper I referenced below where 6-PPD yields NDMA, which is a very widely studied byproduct at a 0.1% molar yield, whereas IPPD is turning out 8% NDMA. That's a big deal. So again, kind of like we started off the topic talking about how PFAS and 6-PPD quinone and microplastics don't exist in a vacuum. Here we are, half an hour, 40 minutes later, talking about how some of these other PPDs and even 6-PPD forms known disinfection byproducts that we've studied for decades. So it's a really interesting time in 6-PPD quinone analysis. We are adding compounds, adding matrices, adding techniques, and we're really trying to support the community as best we can to figure out where this is all going. So it's an exciting time. And if anybody has kind of any questions or just wants to talk about 6-PPD quinone in general, I'm happy to do so afterwards. And with that, I thank you for your time and thank NEBC for having me here. And I would open this up to any questions folks might have.
Andrew, you might be able to take a look too, down in the Q&A feature. If you see that,
I do see that now.
yeah. I see we have a question there.
Yeah, that's the and dimethylamine. I should have spelled that out all the way. It was now that I gave all those slides, it was like a really much more dim outlook than than I intended. But we're excited to start exploring these. The solvent that we're using for wipe samples that just came through, we're using acetonitrile. It's when we started out with the method, we were using methanol for a lot of different applications for 6-PPD quinone. And so the methanol really didn't extract the 6-PPD quinone as aggressively as we needed. So that's why when you read EPA 1630 draft method, EPA 1634, you'll see acetonitrile in the mobile phases, acetonitrile as elution solvents for SPE, and that same kind of dogma follows through to the wipe samples. We would love to use methanol. Methanol would be okay, but it just doesn't pull off 6-PPD quinone like acetonitrile does. And again, acetonitriles, you know, when we ship these out, you shouldn't use acetonitrile on things like polycarbonate and different things like that. So it's not applicable for every single surface. Also, please don't use it on your hands. The wipe samples on the basketball study were done on nitrile gloves.
I see there's a question about if it's possible to access the microphone for a question. I don't believe there is under this particular format we're using. So if sorry for that question coming from ecology. If there was a more detailed question, I guess you could either type it in or contact Andrew offline. Here's another question.
How would you conduct atmospheric monitoring? Atmospheric monitoring, I would likely choose some sort of puffer XAD trap, much like we would some of the other air analyses. Think OTM 45 or something like that, where we could have a filter or not a filter. You could have media that's meant to absorb a lot of different, all sorts of different compounds. If you've worked with XAD or XAD2 or anything else like that, 10X, they just absorb everything nonstop, and that's part of the problem with getting media that's clean enough. But I would probably use a small pump to draw a known amount of air through media, much like everything else. This is not something terribly secret on how to go about monitoring for these compounds. Puff and XAD are kind of like the catch-all. So it would be a great place to start.
Other questions? There's
Oh, there's a couple more. I'm scrolling down here.
okay, good, good.
So can you give us an update on what's being done to reduce 6PPD-Q and stormwater? So I am actually from the Sacramento region. We're coming out of Eurofins, Sacramento here, and we're only about an hour and a half away from Lake Tahoe. And so, in talking with some different people, when you control for turbidity, when you control for just runoff, and whether it be for for those particulate concerns or for nutrients, things like phosphorus, when you sequester that stormwater runoff, you're unintentionally reducing the 6-PPD quinone background, or at least you're concentrating it in that catch basin, and not letting it go out into a swell or stormwater into a waterway. So some of these engineering controls that are meant to help with water clarity unintentionally capture 6-PPD quinone. I know that there are people working on media that is absorptive. Think like biochar, hydrochar, different things like that, where you're going to be incorporating that media into a scenario that's not just specifically for 6-PPD quinone. But I think when we're talking about reducing 6-PPD quinone in stormwater, focus on the particulates. 6-PPD quinone is incredibly sticky. Some of the challenge in bringing the method up was to be able to pull that compound off of our plastics. And so let's use that fact. Let's use the fact that this is really, really sticky to do different remediation strategies.
Any other questions there, Andrew, we haven't covered?
Yeah, Washington Ecology, I see your question on here. Let's reach out to me. It's my name, Andrew.Patterson. I had it up on the email form there, but I think I can find you at Washington Ecology, and I'm happy to talk about that. Talking about sucralose waste. We're also exploring different avenues with wastewater intrusion, and sucralose always comes up there. So I'd be happy to chat with you on that.
Good. I think there's another question that just came in.
Um, 6PD could absorb a set of emergency. Um, yes, we have studied sediments.
And if you can, Andrew, if you can kind of summarize
Read
that
the question. Yeah,
question,
you bet.
yeah, just
Yeah.
because they
So the
can't
question's
see
from
it.
Chelsea Mitchell. Have you studied the potential for 6PPD-Q that is absorbed as sediment to be released during subsequent storm events? We have seen accumulation of 6PPD-Q and sediment and wonder if that might be a reservoir for future release. Yes, we do. We do look at solids and sediments. And I guess I would say anecdotally, they're really hit or miss. And I think that goes back to the transport from 6-PPD quinone being so incredibly sticky. Yeah, so yes, we can look at solids. I've been a part of some pretty interesting solid and sediment studies, and I'm happy to help you out after this. And I do agree with you that there's an unknown stability with 6-PPD quinone once it's sorbed to particulates. The the hold time for aqueous samples was 14 days, and that represents a 90% recovery in aqueous samples. So aqueous samples, you get 90% back after 14 days sitting at any condition, room temperature, in the fridge, anything else like that. But for solids and sediments, I think it's going to be a lot more stable for a lot longer, and have that point source potential. Washington Ecology asked another question. I understand that Eurofins Sacramento is the only lab currently accepting water samples for 6PPD, 6PPD-Q from industries. Is Eurofins likely to have more locations, specifically in Washington or Oregon? I will say not a laboratory location, but we do have service centers. And we do have an excellent metals lab up in Washington that people could drop samples off and effectively have it be a service center. We also support overnight operations on 6-PPD quinone on a routine basis, so that we can work with anybody no matter where they are. And there is work being done up in Alaska, and that's fairly remote. And we can still get samples back out from the field up in Alaska back to our Sacramento laboratory. So, there's not going to be it's a fairly sophisticated setup. Sacramento happens to be our main West Coast PFAS hub as well, and there's similar instrumentation or some of the same instruments. Same type of instruments are used for PFAS. And so it's a fairly sophisticated operation to get set up. So it's going to be sticking around in Sacramento for a while.
Any other questions from the audience? And not seeing any yet, and I'm sure there might be some follow-up questions. Andrew, we will include your email and contact information in the information we send out to the participants if they'd like to reach out to you directly. We might have one more that just came in here. Another one
Yes.
from College.
Yeah. I'll get you that. No problem. And by that, I will get the details to providing a service center in Washington for dropping off 6PPD, 6PPD-Q samples.
Any other closing thoughts, Andrew, as we come to a conclusion?
I'd say really, our role as an analytical laboratory are to support the questions that people are asking and people want to answer. We do that, as neutrally as possible for every single topic, and we rely on analytical standards to be able to have defensible data. So I would just say that this is a rapidly changing field, and we're talking about, kind of, more compounds and chlorination byproducts and other things like that. So I would ask that the standards formulation companies, people like Wellington and CIL and Sigma and HPC and some others, just to be our allies in this journey, because we need standards to be able to answer the questions that folks on this call have.
Great. Well, thank you, Andrew. And just as a reminder for all participants, we will have a copy of the presentation, a link to the video production, I guess, if you will, after this event, probably all being sent out tomorrow, as well as Andrew's contact information. So with that, Andrew, thank you for great presentation. Thank you, Eurofins, for supporting this sort of webinar series NEBC is ramping up. And with that, have a great day, everyone, and watch for additional webinars coming up soon. Thank you.
Thank you.